The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, moving faster than any stagecoach had a right to travel across the New Mexico desert, and Florence Parker knew immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. He had been riding fence line on the southern edge of the Triple Crown Ranch when he spotted the coach careening wildly down the rutted road toward Hillsboro, the horses in full panic, foam flying from their mouths as they galloped without control or direction. The driver was nowhere to be seen on the bench, and Florence could hear screams cutting through the hot September air of 1878, even from half a mile away. He dug his heels into his bay gelding's flanks and urged the horse into a dead run, calculating angles and distances with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 24 years living by his wits in territory that forgave no mistakes. The stagecoach was heading straight for a rocky outcropping where the road curved sharply, and if those horses did not stop or turn soon, the whole thing would tip and roll, killing everyone inside. Florence leaned low over his horse's neck, pushing for every bit of speed, his heart hammering against his ribs as he closed the distance. The gelding responded beautifully, eating up the ground between them and the runaway coach. Florence could see now that there were at least 2 people inside, their faces pressed against the windows, pale with terror. The horses were completely wild, their eyes rolling white, and he knew that something must have spooked them badly to send them into such a state. A rattlesnake, maybe, or a mountain lion. It did not matter now. What mattered was stopping them before they reached that curve. He came alongside the team at a full gallop, his horse matching pace with the crazed animals stride for stride. The wind tore at his hat and he let it fly, focusing entirely on the lead horse's harness. Florence stood in his stirrups, balanced precariously as both horses thundered across the uneven ground, and then he launched himself from his saddle onto the back of the nearest coach horse. The animal bucked and tried to shake him off, but Florence had grown up breaking wild mustangs in West Texas, and he clung on with his thighs while reaching forward for the reins that had been torn from the driver's hands. His fingers closed around leather and he pulled back hard, throwing all his weight into it, his muscles straining as he fought against the momentum of 6 terrified horses and a heavy stagecoach. "Whoa now," he called out, keeping his voice steady despite the chaos. "Easy, easy now." The horses fought him for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Florence kept pulling, kept talking, using every trick he had learned in his years working with horses. Gradually, impossibly, the team began to slow. The lead horse's ears flicked back toward his voice, and he felt the first hint of control returning. The rocky outcropping loomed closer, but the horses were responding now, their panic giving way to training and instinct. 20 yards from disaster, the team finally came to a shuddering halt, their sides heaving, their legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. Florence slid down from the horse's back, still gripping the reins firmly, and moved quickly to check each animal for injury. His own hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, but he forced them steady as he ran them over hot, sweat-soaked flanks and down quivering legs. The stagecoach door burst open and a woman stumbled out, nearly falling to her knees in the dirt. Florence looked up and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and now fell in waves around her shoulders. Her traveling dress was covered in dust, and her green eyes were wide with the aftermath of terror, but there was strength in the way she straightened herself, determination in the set of her jaw. "Are you hurt?" Florence asked, moving toward her while keeping one hand on the lead horse's bridle. "No," she said, and her voice was steadier than he expected. Shaken but whole, thanks to you. She looked at him fully then, really looked at him, and he saw her take in his sweat-stained shirt, his worn leather vest, the gun belt riding low on his hips. You saved our lives. Just happened to be in the right place, Florence said, suddenly aware of how he must look, covered in dust and horse sweat. What happened to your driver? An older man emerged from the coach then, straightening his spectacles with trembling fingers. Fell off about 2 miles back when the horses first spooked. We need to go back for him. I will ride back and check on him, Florence said. But first, let me get you folks into town. These horses are too worked up to pull the coach safely right now, and it is only another mile to Hillsborough. Can you walk it? I can walk, the woman said firmly, and then she smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to absolutely beautiful. I am Julia Morrison, and this is my uncle, Charles Morrison. We are traveling from Santa Fe to Hillsborough, where I am meant to take up a position as the new schoolteacher. Florence Parker, he said, touching 2 fingers to where his hat should have been before remembering it had blown off somewhere during the rescue. I work at the Triple Crown Ranch just outside town. Welcome to Hillsborough, Miss Morrison, though I wish your arrival had been less eventful. So do I, Julia said with a small laugh that held an edge of hysteria. Though I must say, if one is to have a dramatic introduction to a new town, being rescued by a cowboy who leaps onto runaway horses certainly makes for a memorable story. Florence felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the desert sun. He busied himself with securing the team properly, talking softly to the horses while trying not to be too aware of Julia Morrison watching him work. When he glanced up again, she was helping her uncle gather their scattered luggage from inside the coach, moving with a calm efficiency that impressed him. The driver, Charles Morrison said again, his face creased with worry. We really must find him. He could be badly injured. My horse should be around here somewhere, Florence said, scanning the landscape. He spotted his bay gelding grazing peacefully about 50 yards away, unconcerned by all the drama. He whistled and the horse raised its head, then trotted over obediently. I will backtrack and find him. You folks start walking toward town. Follow this road and you cannot miss it. When you get there, find Doc Brennan on Main Street and tell him what happened. I will bring the driver in as soon as I locate him. Will you not need help? Julia asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice. I will move faster alone, Florence said. And your uncle looks like he could use a chance to sit down in the shade with something cool to drink. Charles Morrison nodded, not bothering to deny it. The older man did look pale and shaky, and Florence worried briefly about his heart. But Julia was already supporting her uncle's arm, guiding him toward the road with a gentleness that spoke of deep affection. Will we see you again? Julia asked, turning back to look at Florence one more time. I would like to thank you properly, once we have all recovered from this ordeal. I am sure we will cross paths, Florence said, and found himself hoping desperately that it was true. Hillsborough is not a large town. He watched them start down the road, Julia's traveling dress stirring up small clouds of dust with each step, and then he swung himself into his saddle and turned his horse back the way the stagecoach had come. The driver was not hard to find. He lay in a heap about 1.5 miles up the road, conscious but clearly in pain. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and he had blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. Got thrown when the horses bolted, the man gasped as Florence knelt beside him. Rattlesnake on the road, big one. Spooked them good. You have broken your leg, Florence said, examining the injury carefully. I am going to have to set it before I can move you, and it is going to hurt like hell. Just do what you need to do, the driver said through gritted teeth. Name is Tom Haskins, by the way. been driving coaches through this territory for 12 years and never had a spill like this. Florence worked as quickly and gently as he could, setting the bone and splinting it with pieces torn from his own shirt and some straight branches he found near the road. Tom Haskins cursed fluently but did not cry out, and Florence respected him for it. Getting the injured man onto his horse was even more difficult, but eventually they managed it, with Tom sitting in front of Florence, half-conscious from pain. The ride into Hillsborough took nearly an hour at the slow pace required, and by the time they arrived the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Doc Brennan met them outside his office, having already been alerted by Julia and her uncle, and several townspeople rushed forward to help carry Tom inside. "The lady and her uncle," Florence asked Doc Brennan as they settled Tom onto the examination table. "At the hotel, resting," the doctor said, already cutting away the makeshift splint to examine Florence's work. "You did a good job here, son. Clean break, properly set. He will heal fine, though he will be laid up for a couple of months." Florence felt relief wash over him. "I should go check on them." Doc Brennan looked up from his patient with knowing eyes. "The hotel is 2 blocks down on the right. Miss Morrison specifically asked me to tell you where they were staying when you came back." The Hillsborough Hotel was a modest 2-story building with a wide front porch and flower boxes in the windows. Florence hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how filthy he was, covered in sweat and dust and blood. But before he could decide whether to go in or head back to the ranch to clean up first, Julia Morrison appeared in the doorway. She had changed into a fresh dress of pale blue cotton, and her dark hair was neatly pinned again, though a few curls still escaped to frame her face. She looked composed and proper, every inch the schoolteacher she was meant to be, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Mr. Parker," she said warmly, "I was hoping you would come. Please tell me the driver is safe." "Broken leg and some cuts, but he will recover," Florence said, climbing the porch steps. "Doc Brennan says I set the bone properly." "You know how to set bones as well as stop runaway horses?" Julia asked, and there was admiration in her voice that made Florence's heart beat faster. "You are a man of many talents. Just things you learn when you live in country where the nearest doctor might be a day's ride away," Florence said, feeling awkward and self-conscious under her gaze. "I should let you rest, Miss Morrison. You have had quite a day." "Would you join my uncle and me for dinner?" Julia asked quickly. "The hotel dining room serves meals, and it seems the least we can do after what you did for us. Please say yes." Florence wanted to refuse, wanted to explain that he was too dirty to sit down in a proper dining room, that he needed to get back to the ranch where his boss would be wondering why he had not returned from checking fence line. But looking at Julia Morrison's hopeful face, he found himself saying yes instead. "Give me an hour to go clean up," he said. "I am not fit for polite company right now." "An hour then," Julia agreed, and her smile was worth every bit of awkwardness he felt. Florence rode back to the Triple Crown Ranch at a pace just short of reckless, his mind racing even faster than his horse. He could not remember the last time a woman had affected him like this, could not remember ever feeling this urgent pull towards someone he had just met. It was crazy. It was impractical. It was potentially disastrous for a ranch hand with no real prospects to start imagining anything with a respectable schoolteacher who had probably been raised with education and refinement. But he could not stop thinking about the way she had smiled at him, the strength in her voice despite her fear, the kindness in her concern for the injured driver. His bunkhouse was empty when he arrived, the other ranch hands still out working. Florence heated water for a bath and scrubbed himself clean, shaved carefully, and put on his one good shirt. the dark blue one his mother had sent him 2 Christmases ago. He combed his hair, checked his reflection in the small mirror above his bunk, and felt foolish for caring so much about his appearance. "You are acting like a schoolboy with his first crush," he told his reflection. But that did not stop him from checking his appearance one more time before heading back to town. The hotel dining room was half full when he arrived. Local families and travelers eating their evening meals at tables covered with checkered cloths. Julia and Charles Morrison sat at a corner table, and Julia waved when she saw him, gesturing him over with such genuine pleasure that his nervousness eased slightly. "You clean up remarkably well, Mr. Parker," Julia said as he took the seat across from her. Her eyes sparkled with humor, but there was warmth there too, something that suggested she was as aware of him as he was of her. "Please call me Florence," he said. "Mr. Parker makes me feel like you are talking to my father." "Then you must call me Julia," she replied. "Though I suppose as the new schoolteacher I shall have to get used to being Miss Morrison most of the time." Charles Morrison cleared his throat, reminding them both of his presence. "I want to add my thanks to my nieces, young man. You showed remarkable courage and skill today. Without you, I hate to think what would have happened." "I am just glad I was there," Florence said honestly. "How are you both feeling? No injuries you did not notice in the excitement, just bruises," Charles said. "Though I confess my old bones do not bounce back from such adventures the way they might have in my youth." He smiled at his niece. "Julia is made of sterner stuff. She barely even complained during the walk to town." "There was no point in complaining," Julia said practically. "And the walk gave me a chance to see some of the country around Hillsborough. It is beautiful in a harsh sort of way, very different from Santa Fe." They ordered dinner and fell into easy conversation. Florence learned that Julia had been teaching in Santa Fe for the past 2 years, but had leaped at the chance to take the position in Hillsborough, because it came with better pay and a small house of her own. Her parents had died when she was 16, and Charles Morrison, her father's brother, had raised her and paid for her education at a teaching college in Kansas. "I want to make something of myself," Julia said with quiet determination. "I want to prove that the investment in my education was worthwhile. And I want to show the children in Hillsborough that learning can open doors they might not know existed." Florence found himself telling her about his own childhood in West Texas, about losing his family to a Comanche raid when he was 14, and making his way west alone, taking work where he could find it until he landed at the Triple Crown Ranch 5 years ago. He did not usually talk about his past, but something about Julia made him want to share it, made him feel safe being honest about where he had come from. "You have survived so much," Julia said softly when he finished, "and you still find it in yourself to risk your life for strangers. That speaks to the kind of man you are, Florence." "Some things are worth the risk," Florence said, and the words hung in the air between them, taking on meaning beyond the rescue, beyond anything he had consciously intended to say. But once spoken, he did not want to take them back. Julia's cheeks flushed pink and she looked down at her plate, but she was smiling. Charles Morrison looked between them with raised eyebrows, and Florence wondered if he should feel embarrassed, but he did not. He felt more alive, more hopeful than he had in years. After dinner, Florence walked them upstairs to their rooms, moving slowly, reluctant to end the evening. At Julia's door, she turned to face him, and in the dim lamplight of the hallway, she looked almost ethereal. "Will you call on me again?" she asked. "I know we have only just met, but I would like to see you again, Florence." "I would like that too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I work most days, but I could come to town on Sunday after church if that would suit you." "That would suit me very well," Julia said. I should go to church anyway to introduce myself to the congregation. I imagine most of the school parents will be there. Then I will see you Sunday, Florence said. He wanted to say more, wanted to do more, but he was aware of her uncle standing discreetly a few feet away, and of the proprieties that a schoolteacher had to maintain. So he simply touched his hat and walked away, though he looked back once and found her still standing in her doorway, watching him go. The ride back to the ranch felt endless, his mind replaying every moment of the evening, every word Julia had spoken, every smile she had given him. He was in trouble, deep trouble, and he knew it. He had no business courting a schoolteacher. What could he offer her? A ranch hand's wages, a life of uncertainty, none of the stability and respectability she deserved. But when he closed his eyes that night, all he could see was Julia Morrison's face, and all he could hear was her voice asking him to call on her again. Some things are worth the risk, he had said, and he was beginning to understand just how true that was. Sunday dawned clear and bright, and Florence was up before the sun, too restless to sleep. He did his morning chores in record time, ignoring the good-natured teasing of the other ranch hands about his unusual eagerness to get to church. He wore his good shirt again and his cleanest pair of pants, and made sure his horse was groomed until it shone. The church in Hillsborough was a simple white building with a tall steeple, and it was already filling with people when Florence arrived. He spotted Julia immediately, sitting near the front with her uncle, wearing a green dress that matched her eyes. She turned as if feeling his gaze and smiled at him over her shoulder, a smile that made his chest feel too small to contain his heart. The service passed in a blur. Florence stood when he was supposed to stand, sat when he was supposed to sit, but he could not have repeated a word of the sermon if his life depended on it. All his attention was focused on Julia, on the graceful line of her neck, on the way the sunlight through the stained glass windows cast colored shadows across her hair. After the service, there was the usual socializing on the church lawn, and Florence watched as Julia was surrounded by families eager to meet the new schoolteacher. She handled it with grace, learning names, asking questions about the children, showing genuine interest in everyone she met. But her eyes kept finding him across the crowd, and eventually she excused herself and made her way over to where he stood. "I was afraid you might not come," she said quietly. "I said I would be here," Florence replied. "I keep my word." "I am learning that about you," Julia said. "Would you like to take a walk? My uncle is deep in conversation with the mayor about local politics, and I could use some air." They walked through the town, Florence pointing out important landmarks: the general store, the telegraph office, the saloon, which he quickly assured her was not a place she would ever need to visit. Julia asked intelligent questions about the town's economy, its population, the challenges facing the community. She was clearly someone who wanted to understand her new home, who took her responsibilities seriously. "The schoolhouse is just up here," Florence said, leading her down a side street. "It is not much to look at from the outside, but I hear it is sound enough." The schoolhouse was a rectangular building with large windows and a small bell tower. Julia walked around it slowly, peering through the windows, testing the front steps, examining everything with a critical eye. "It will do nicely," she said finally. "The children will have good light for reading, and there is space for a small library in the back corner. I brought some of my own books with me, and I hope to acquire more as time goes on." "You really love teaching," Florence observed. "I do," Julia said simply. "There is something miraculous about watching a child's face light up when they suddenly understand something they have been struggling with, or when they discover they can read a word they could not read before. Education changes lives, Florence." It certainly changed mine." They sat on the schoolhouse steps, and Julia told him more about her work in Santa Fe, about students who had struggled and triumphed, about parents who had been skeptical of education until they saw their children thriving. Florence found himself captivated not just by what she said but by the passion with which she said it. This was not just a job to Julia Morrison. It was a calling. "What about you?" Julia asked. "Do you plan to be a ranch hand forever, or do you have other dreams?" It was a fair question, and Florence considered it carefully before answering. "I have been saving my wages," he said. "There is a piece of land about 10 miles from here, good grazing land with a creek running through it. The owner died last year, and his widow is willing to sell cheap because she wants to move back east to live with her daughter. I have almost enough saved for a down payment. I figure if I can buy that land, I can start small, maybe a dozen head of cattle at first, build from there. I am good with horses too. I could breed and train them, sell to the army or to other ranchers." "You want your own ranch," Julia said, and there was understanding in her voice. "Your own place where you answer to no one but yourself." "Is that foolish?" Florence asked. "A ranch hand dreaming of being a rancher. Not foolish at all," Julia said firmly. "It is exactly what I meant about education and dreams. We should all want to better ourselves, to build something meaningful with our lives." She looked at him with such warmth that he felt emboldened. "Julia," he began, then hesitated. "I know we have only just met, and I know I have no right to presume anything, but I would like to court you properly if you would allow it. I realize that, as the school teacher, you have a reputation to maintain, and I am just a ranch hand with more ambition than prospects, so I would understand if you felt it was not appropriate." Julia reached out and took his hand, a bold gesture that made his heart race. "Florence Parker, I would be honored to have you court me. And for the record, you are not just a ranch hand. You are a man with courage and kindness and dreams, and those things matter far more to me than your current position in life." They sat there on the schoolhouse steps, hands clasped, grinning at each other like fools, until they heard Charles Morrison calling for Julia from the main street. Reluctantly, they stood and walked back toward town, not quite touching but close enough that Florence could feel the warmth of her presence beside him. Over the following weeks, Florence and Julia fell into a pattern. He would ride into town on Sundays after church, and sometimes on Wednesday evenings, when he could get away from the ranch early enough. They would walk together, always properly chaperoned by either her uncle or various townspeople, who seemed to materialize whenever the schoolteacher and her cowboy spent time together. They talked about everything: their pasts, their hopes, their observations about the world. Florence brought her wildflowers from the ranch land, and Julia read him passages from her favorite books, opening up worlds of literature he had never experienced. The more time Florence spent with Julia, the more certain he became that he wanted to build a life with her. But he also became increasingly aware of the obstacles in their path. He was still just a ranch hand, still living in a bunkhouse, still years away from having his own land unless something changed dramatically. And Julia was the schoolteacher, a woman of education and refinement, respected in the community. What kind of life could he offer her? These thoughts occupied his mind one October morning as he worked with a particularly stubborn young horse in the ranch's breaking corral. The horse was a beautiful paint gelding with spirit to spare, and Florence was so focused on reading the animal's movements that he did not notice his boss, Thomas Rutherford, watching from the fence until the man spoke. "You have got a gift with horses, Parker," Rutherford said. "That paint has thrown every other man who tried to work with him, but you have got him listening." "He just needs someone to be patient with him," Florence said, keeping his attention on the horse. He has been manhandled before. You can see it in how he flinches. He needs to learn that not all humans are going to hurt him. Rutherford was quiet for a moment, then said, I have been thinking about expanding the ranch's horse breeding operation. Good horses bring good money, especially with the army buying. I need someone to run it, someone who understands horses the way you do. Would you be interested in the job? It would come with better pay, your own cabin instead of the bunkhouse, and a percentage of the profits from horses you train and sell. Florence's hands stilled on the rope. Why me? You have men who have been here longer. Because none of them have your skill, Rutherford said bluntly. I saw what you did stopping that runaway stagecoach last month. I heard about how you saved that driver's life, and I have watched you work with horses for 5 years now. You are wasted as a regular hand, Parker. I want to give you a chance to be more. It was exactly the kind of opportunity Florence had been hoping for, the kind that could change everything. With better pay and a share of profits, he could save enough for that land in half the time. He could offer Julia a real future instead of just dreams. I would be honored, sir, Florence said. Thank you. Start next week, Rutherford said. We will go over the details tonight after supper. Florence could barely contain his excitement. That evening, as soon as his work was done, he saddled his horse and rode into town, propriety be damned. He found Julia at the schoolhouse, cleaning slates and arranging books for the next day's lessons. Her face lit up when she saw him at the door. Florence, I was not expecting you until Sunday. I have news, he said, practically bursting with it. Good news, I think. He told her about Rutherford's offer, about the promotion and the raise and what it could mean for his plans to buy land. Julia listened with growing delight, and when he finished she threw her arms around him in a very improper hug that he returned enthusiastically. This is wonderful, she said, pulling back just enough to look up at him, her hands still on his shoulders. I am so proud of you, Florence. You see, hard work and talent do get rewarded. It means I can start thinking about the future more seriously, Florence said, about buying that land, building a house. He paused, then took a breath and plunged ahead, about asking you to marry me eventually. Not yet, I know we have not been courting long enough for that to be proper. But someday, Julia, I want to be able to offer you a real life. Julia's eyes grew bright with tears, but she was smiling. You could offer me a tent in the desert and I would still want to be with you, Florence Parker. But I appreciate that you want to build something solid first. I have my position to think of too. Married women do not usually teach, so we would need to find someone to replace me before I could consider leaving my post. The children deserve that. You are always thinking of others, Florence said softly, touching her cheek. It is one of the 1,000 things I love about you. The word hung in the air between them. Love. He had said it without meaning to, but now that it was spoken, he realized how true it was. He loved Julia Morrison with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified him. I love you too, Julia whispered. I think I have loved you since that first day when you stopped those horses and looked at me with such concern. I know it is fast. I know we should be more sensible, but I cannot help how I feel. Florence kissed her then, a gentle kiss that spoke of promise and hope and all the tomorrows they would build together. It was improper, kissing her in the schoolhouse where anyone might see, but neither of them cared. They had found something rare and precious, and they both knew it. The next months passed in a blur of hard work and growing contentment. Florence threw himself into his new position, working long hours to build up the ranch's horse breeding program. He selected mares with good bloodlines, broke and trained young horses with patience and skill, and negotiated sales with army representatives and other ranchers. His reputation grew, and with it, his savings. Julia thrived as Hillsborough's schoolteacher. Her classroom was full of eager students, and even the most skeptical parents had to admit their children were learning. She organized spelling bees and recitation contests, started a small lending library, and made education exciting for children who might otherwise have seen it as a chore. She and Florence continued their courtship, always proper in public, but stealing precious moments alone whenever they could, building a foundation of friendship and trust alongside their growing love. By Christmas, Florence had saved enough to make an offer on the land he wanted. The widow accepted, and suddenly he owned 160 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through it. It was not much, there was no house yet, just the remains of an old barn that would need rebuilding, but it was his. He owned land. He was no longer just a ranch hand dreaming of better days. He was a landowner and a horse trainer with a solid reputation and a growing bank account. On Christmas Day, after church services, Florence asked Charles Morrison for permission to propose to Julia. The older man had seen their courtship develop and approved, giving his blessing with genuine pleasure. That evening, as snow began to fall gently over Hillsborough's Main Street, Florence took Julia's hand and led her to the schoolhouse steps where they had first talked about their dreams. "Julia Morrison," he said, pulling a simple gold ring from his pocket. "You have changed my life in every way that matters. You have made me want to be better, to build something worthy of you. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Julia's answer was immediate. Yes. Yes. 1,000 times yes. They were married in late March of 1879 in the same white church where they had first attended services together. Julia wore a simple cream-colored dress that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair, and Florence wore a new suit that he had ordered from the general store, spending money recklessly for the first time in his life, because this was a moment that deserved extravagance. Charles Morrison gave Julia away, and half the town attended the ceremony, genuinely happy for the schoolteacher and her cowboy. Julia had found a replacement teacher, a young woman from Denver who had family in Hillsborough and was eager for the position. Julia had spent weeks preparing her successor, making sure her students would be well cared for, because even in her happiness, she thought of others first. It was just one more reason Florence loved her. After the wedding, there was a party at the hotel with dancing and food and speeches. Florence danced with his wife, and marveled at how his life had transformed in just 7 months. Last September, he had been a ranch hand with nothing but dreams. Now he had land, a growing business, and a wife he adored. It seemed impossible, like something that happened in the dime novels Julia sometimes read aloud to him. Their wedding night was spent at the hotel, and Florence was gentle with Julia, aware that for all her intelligence and strength, this was new territory for both of them. They took their time discovering each other, and if there was awkwardness, there was also laughter and tenderness and love that made every moment precious. The next morning they traveled out to the land that was now theirs. Florence had been working for weeks to make the old barn habitable as a temporary dwelling. It was rough, certainly nothing like the house he wanted to build for Julia, but she looked around at the one-room space with its simple furniture and declared it perfect. "This is ours," she said, spreading her arms wide. "Our home, our land, our future. Oh, Florence, it is more than I ever dreamed of." They spent their first weeks of marriage working side by side to build a life. Florence had arranged to keep working part-time for Rutherford, while also developing his own horse breeding operation on his land. Julia threw herself into making their rough dwelling into a home, sewing curtains, planting a small garden, cooking meals over the fireplace. It was hard work, but they were young and strong and desperately in love. And every evening when they fell into bed exhausted, they fell asleep in each other's arms, content. By summer, Florence had enough horses on his land to justify building proper corrals and a breaking pen. He worked with 3 mares and their foals, plus 2 young geldings he was training to sell. His reputation continued to grow, and people began traveling from surrounding towns to buy horses from the man who had stopped the runaway stagecoach and then married the schoolteacher. It became a romantic story people liked to tell, the kind of story that brought customers. In August, Julia told him she was pregnant. Florence's first reaction was pure joy, followed immediately by terror. A child meant more responsibility, more pressure to succeed, more chances for something to go wrong. But when he looked at Julia's glowing face, all his fear faded into determination. He would build a proper house before the baby came. He would make sure Julia had everything she needed. He would be the father his own father had been present, loving, devoted before tragedy had stolen him away. He hired 2 men from town to help him, and together they spent the fall building a house on a rise overlooking the creek. It was not large or fancy, but it was solidly built with 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a sitting room with a fireplace. Julia cried when she saw it finished, and Florence carried her over the threshold even though they were already married, just because it felt right. Their first child was born in February of 1880, during a snowstorm that made it impossible to fetch the doctor from town. Florence delivered his own son with the help of a neighbor woman who lived 5 miles away and had managed to make it through the snow. It was the most terrifying experience of his life, but when he heard that first cry and saw Julia holding their baby, exhausted but triumphant, he knew he would remember this moment forever. They named him Samuel after Florence's father, and Charles after Julia's uncle. Samuel Charles Parker was a healthy baby with a strong set of lungs and his mother's green eyes. Florence held his son and felt something shift in his understanding of the world. He had thought he knew what love was, but this was different, bigger somehow, an almost painful tenderness mixed with fierce protectiveness. "You stopped those horses and saved us both," Julia said one night as she nursed Samuel. "When I think about what might have happened if you had not been there that day, if the stagecoach had crashed." She shuddered. "But it did not," Florence said, settling beside her on their bed. "And I did stop them, and here we are." "Some things are worth the risk," Julia said, echoing the words he had spoken all those months ago. "You risked your life for strangers, and look what came of it. We found each other. We built this life. We have this beautiful child. Best risk I ever took," Florence agreed. The years that followed were full of hard work and steady growth. Florence's horse breeding operation flourished. He became known throughout New Mexico territory for producing reliable, well-trained horses, and his income grew accordingly. Julia devoted herself to raising Samuel, and then, 2 years later, to raising their daughter Emma, a red-haired sprite with her father's stubborn determination. They expanded the house, adding more bedrooms and a proper porch where Julia liked to sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. Florence hired help as the ranch grew, first 1 man, then 2, then a family who lived in a cabin on the far edge of the property and helped with both horses and cattle, which Florence had started raising on the side. Charles Morrison moved to the ranch after a small stroke left him unable to live alone. He recovered his health in the clean air and became a beloved grandfather figure to Samuel and Emma, telling them stories and teaching them to read from his extensive collection of books. He lived with them for 7 happy years before passing away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72. Life was not always easy. There were droughts that dried the creek to a trickle, harsh winters that killed livestock, accidents and illnesses and setbacks. But Florence and Julia faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each challenge overcome. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Julia gave birth to twins, boy-girl pair they named Thomas and Grace. The ranch house rang with the noise of children, and Florence would sometimes stop in the middle of his work just to listen to that sound and marvel at how blessed he was. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching their 4 children play in the yard. Samuel was 14 now, already showing promise with horses and talking about learning his father's trade. Emma was 12, bookish like her mother and dreaming of becoming a writer. The twins were rambunctious 8-year-olds who got into everything and kept their parents constantly on their toes. "I was thinking about the day we met," Florence said, "about how I was just riding fence line doing my job, and then suddenly there was this runaway stagecoach, and I made a split-second decision to try to stop it." "And thank God you did," Julia said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I was thinking about how different my life would be if I had decided it was too dangerous, if I had just watched from a distance and told myself it was not my problem. I would still be a ranch hand living in a bunkhouse, alone, never knowing what I was missing. Never knowing you, never having our children, never building this life." "But you did not hesitate," Julia said. "That is who you are, Florence. You see what needs to be done and you do it, no matter the risk." "Some things are worth the risk," Florence said, and Julia laughed. "You are never going to stop saying that, are you?" "Why would I? It is the truest thing I know." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over their land, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Samuel called something to Emma, and she responded with a laugh. Thomas and Grace were chasing each other in circles, their giggles carrying on the evening breeze. Inside the house, Florence could see the lamp burning in Charles Morrison's old room, where Julia had set up a small library and writing space. "You ever regret giving up teaching?" Florence asked. It was a question he had asked before, because he wanted to make sure Julia never felt she had sacrificed too much for their life together. "Not for a moment," Julia said firmly. "I loved teaching, and I like to think I made a difference in those children's lives. But this, Florence, our family, our ranch, watching our own children grow and learn, this is everything I ever wanted. I teach our children, and I lend books to families in town, and when the new school teacher needs advice, she comes here and we talk. I am still contributing, still making education a priority. I am just doing it differently now." "You are the best mother those children could have," Florence said. "The best wife I could have. I hope you know that." "I know that I am lucky," Julia said. "We are both lucky. We found each other in the most improbable way, and we built something beautiful together." Samuel ran up to the porch then, his face flushed with excitement. "Pa, one of the mares is showing signs of foaling. I think it might be tonight." Florence stood, already shifting into work mode. "Which mare, the bay or the gray?" "The gray, the one you said would foal early." "I will come check on her," Florence said. He looked down at Julia. "Duty calls." "Go," Julia said with a smile, "but be careful. Remember, you are not 24 anymore." "I am only 35, Florence protested, but he kissed her cheek and followed Samuel toward the horse barn, Emma trailing after them because she never liked to miss anything interesting. Grace and Thomas lost interest quickly and ran back to their game, but Julia remained on the porch, watching her family with deep contentment. The foaling went well, producing a strong colt with good conformation that would fetch a high price when it was old enough to sell. Florence stayed with the mare until he was sure both mother and baby were healthy, with Samuel assisting and Emma taking notes in her journal because she liked to document everything. By the time they returned to the house, it was fully dark and Julia had dinner waiting. These were the moments Florence treasured most. His family gathered around the table, talking and laughing, sharing the day's events. He had grown up with family dinners like this, before the raid that took his parents and siblings. For years after that, he had eaten alone or in the company of other ranch hands, men who were colleagues but not family. Now he had reclaimed that sense of belonging, that feeling of being part of something larger than himself. After dinner, the children scattered to their evening activities. Samuel returned to the barn to check on the new foal one more time. Emma settled in with a book. The twins played a noisy game involving toy horses and elaborate stories. Florence helped Julia clean up from dinner, a routine they had established early in their marriage. She washed, he dried, and they talked about the mundane details of their day: who needed new shoes, which fence needed mending, where they should plant the new apple trees Julia wanted to add to their small orchard. "I got a letter from Susan today," Julia said, referring to the woman who had replaced her as Hillsborough's schoolteacher. "She is getting married next month and moving to Albuquerque with her husband. She wants to know if I would consider coming back to teach until they find a replacement." Florence's hands stilled on the plate he was drying. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I would think about it and discuss it with you," Julia said. "It would only be temporary, maybe 3 or 4 months. Emma is old enough to watch the twins after school, and you have good help with the ranch now. But I also know it would be a lot to ask, having me gone during the day and trying to manage everything here." "You want to do it?" Florence asked. "That is the real question." "Would going back to teaching make you happy?" Julia was quiet for a moment, her hands still in the dishwater. "I think it might," she said finally. "I miss it sometimes, Florence. I miss the children and the learning and the feeling of making a difference in that particular way. But I do not want to do anything that would burden you or neglect our children." "Our children are healthy and happy and well cared for," Florence said. "And I have 3 hired men now, plus Samuel is old enough to do real work. If you want to teach again for a few months, we can make it work." He set down the dish towel and turned her to face him. "I never want you to give up something you love because you think you have to. We are partners, Julia. We figure things out together." She kissed him, a soft kiss that tasted of soap and happiness. "Have I told you lately that I love you?" "Not in the past few hours," Florence said with mock seriousness. "I was starting to wonder." Julia swatted his arm playfully, and he caught her hand and pulled her close, holding her against his chest and breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. They stood like that for a long moment, just being together, before the twins came running in with a question about their game, and the moment was broken. Julia did return to teaching that fall, and she thrived on it just as Florence had known she would. The children of Hillsborough benefited from having an experienced teacher who truly cared about their education, and Julia came home each evening full of stories about her students' progress and struggles. Florence managed the ranch with the help of Samuel and his hired men, and Emma proved herself surprisingly capable of managing her younger siblings. When a permanent replacement teacher was finally hired in January, Julia came home with mixed feelings. She was ready to focus fully on her family again, but she had also been reminded of how much she loved teaching. She and Florence had long conversations about how she might continue to contribute to education in the community without taking on a full-time position. And eventually, Julia started offering evening classes for adults who wanted to learn to read or improve their literacy. It was perfect for her meaningful work that fit around her family obligations. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their children's lives. Samuel grew into a man who was his father's equal in skill with horses. He married at 21, a sensible young woman from Hillsborough named Catherine, and they built their own house on the Parker land, becoming partners in the family business. Emma did become a writer, publishing stories in territorial newspapers and magazines under her own name, a source of pride for her mother who had encouraged her literary ambitions. The twins, Thomas and Grace, were as different as twins could be. Thomas practical and hardworking, Grace dreamy and artistic, but both found their place in the world. Florence and Julia added one more child to their family in their late 30s, a surprise baby girl they named Faith, because she represented their faith in the future and in their continued strength as a family. Faith was doted on by her older siblings and grew up surrounded by love and laughter. By the time Florence and Julia celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1904, they had become pillars of the Hillsborough community. The Parker Ranch was one of the most successful operations in southern New Mexico, known for producing quality horses that were sought after throughout the territory. Florence trained not just horses but people, teaching younger ranchers his methods and sharing his knowledge freely. Julia had become the community's unofficial education advocate, serving on the school board and helping to establish a small library in town. She still taught occasional adult education classes and mentored young teachers just starting their careers. Together, Florence and Julia had built something that extended far beyond their own family. They had contributed to building a community. Their anniversary celebration was a large affair, with family and friends coming from all over the territory. Samuel and Catherine had 3 children of their own now. Emma had married a journalist from Santa Fe and had 2 daughters. Thomas was courting a rancher's daughter from Silver City, and Grace had shocked everyone by becoming a teacher herself, following in her mother's footsteps. Faith, now 14, helped organize the party with characteristic enthusiasm. As Florence stood before the assembled guests, Julia at his side, he found himself thinking once again about that September day in 1878 when he had spotted a runaway stagecoach and made the split-second decision to try to stop it. "Most of you know the story of how Julia and I met," he said, and there were chuckles and nods around the room because it had become a local legend. "I stopped a runaway stagecoach," she thanked me, "and I apparently decided on the spot that I was going to marry her, though I had the good sense not to mention that right away." More laughter, and Julia squeezed his hand. "What I think about now, looking back over 25 years, is how easily it could have gone differently. I could have decided it was too dangerous. I could have told myself it was not my problem. I could have made the safe choice, which was to stay where I was and not risk my neck for strangers. And if I had made that choice, I would have missed out on everything that has made my life worth living." He looked at Julia, at their children and grandchildren, at the community they had helped build. "I have said many times over the years that some things are worth the risk. It has become sort of a joke in our family, but I mean it more seriously than I can express. Love is worth the risk. Family is worth the risk. Building something meaningful is worth the risk. Taking the chance to do the right thing even when it is dangerous or difficult, that is worth the risk." There were tears in Julia's eyes as she stepped forward to speak. "When Florence stopped that stagecoach, he saved my life and my uncle's life. But he did more than that. He showed me what kind of man he was: brave, skilled, and good. And then he spent the next months proving that first impression was accurate. He has been my partner in every sense of the word, supporting my dreams while building his own, raising our children to be good people who contribute to the world, creating a legacy that extends far beyond what either of us could have accomplished alone." She turned to face him fully. "Florence Parker, you are the best man I have ever known, and I thank God every day for runaway horses and cowboys brave enough to stop them. I love you more now than I did when we married, and I look forward to spending however many years we have left together." Florence kissed his wife in front of everyone, not caring that it was perhaps too demonstrative for a formal party. Let people talk. After 25 years, he and Julia had earned the right to show their love openly. The party continued late into the night with music and dancing and storytelling. Florence danced with Julia, then with each of his daughters, then with his granddaughters. He talked with Samuel about expanding their operation into cattle ranching more seriously. He listened to Emma read excerpts from her latest story. He joked with Thomas and admired Grace's new paintings. He watched Faith dance with a young man from town and tried not to feel too old at the realization that his youngest child was growing up. Later, when the guests had finally gone home and the family had dispersed to their various houses, Florence and Julia walked through the moonlit ranch yard arm in arm, just the two of them. "It has been a good life," Julia said softly. "The best life," Florence agreed. "Sometimes I still cannot believe it is real, that all of this came from one moment of deciding to take a risk." "It came from you being the kind of person who would take that risk," Julia corrected. "And from both of us being willing to work hard to build something together. The moment we met was important, but it was everything that came after that really mattered." They had reached the creek that ran through their property, the same creek that had been one of the selling points when Florence had bought this land all those years ago. The water sparkled in the moonlight, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Florence put his arm around Julia, and she leaned into him, both of them comfortable in a silence that came from decades of knowing each other completely. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Julia asked. "When we were sitting on the schoolhouse steps and I asked if you planned to be a ranch hand forever. I told you about wanting to buy land and start my own operation," Florence said. "You told me your dreams," Julia said. "You trusted me with them, even though we had just met. That meant something to me, that you saw me as someone worth confiding in." "You were easy to talk to," Florence said. "You still are. That has not changed." "We have changed, though," Julia said. "We are older now, grayer, slower. Our children are grown and having children of their own. But somehow it does not feel like we have lost anything. It just feels like we have gained more." "That is because we built something that lasts," Florence said. "Not just the ranch or the house or the business. We built a family, a real family, and that is the kind of wealth that never diminishes." They stood by the creek for a while longer, then walked slowly back to their house, the house Florence had built with his own hands when Julia was pregnant with their first child. It had been expanded and improved over the years, but the bones of it were still the same, solid and true, just like their marriage in their bedroom. Julia brushed out her hair while Florence got ready for bed, another nightly routine they had performed thousands of times. There was comfort in the familiar, in knowing what would come next, in having someone who knew you so completely that words were often unnecessary. "Some things are worth the risk," Julia said suddenly, catching Florence's eye in the mirror. He smiled, recognizing his own words turned back on him. "Yes, they are." "I am glad you thought I was one of those things," Julia said seriously. "I am glad you courted me even though I was the school teacher and you were just a ranch hand. I am glad you did not let the difference in our positions stop you from pursuing what you wanted." "You were worth any risk," Florence said, coming to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "You are worth every risk, always have been, always will be." They went to bed and lay in the darkness, hands clasped between them, talking quietly about nothing in particular until they drifted into sleep. It was an ordinary night, unremarkable except that it was part of a lifetime of ordinary nights spent together, and those ordinary moments were what made a life extraordinary. The years continued to unfold. Florence and Julia grew older gracefully, maintaining their health and vigor far longer than many of their contemporaries. They took joy in watching their grandchildren grow, in seeing their children succeed in their own lives, in knowing that what they had built would continue long after they were gone. Florence never lost his gift with horses, though eventually he passed the day-to-day training work to Samuel and focused more on breeding programs and business strategy. Julia continued her education advocacy work well into her 60s, still sharp as ever, still passionate about making sure every child had access to learning. They traveled some in their later years, taking the train to Denver and Santa Fe, visiting Emma and her family, seeing places they had only read about in their youth. But they always came back to the ranch in Hillsboro, to the land where they had built their life together. On a warm spring evening in 1912, Florence and Julia sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. They were both in their late 50s now, their hair silver, their faces lined with years of sun and wind and laughter. Around them, the ranch bustled with activity as it always did, grandchildren playing, horses nickering in the corrals, the sound of voices calling back and forth. "You know what today is?" Julia asked. Florence thought for a moment, running through the calendar in his mind. "Tuesday." Julia laughed. "Yes, but it is also September 15th. 34 years ago today, you stopped a runaway stagecoach and met me for the first time." Florence shook his head in wonder. 34 years? That cannot be right. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. "I was thinking about that young woman who stepped off that stagecoach, so frightened but trying to be brave," Julia said. "I was thinking about the cowboy who looked at me like I was something precious, even though I was covered in dust and trembling from fear. We were so young, Florence. We had no idea what we were building." "I knew," Florence said. "Maybe not consciously, but some part of me knew that you were going to change my life. I felt it the moment I saw you." "Love at first sight," Julia teased gently. "Something like that," Florence admitted. "Or maybe recognition. Like my soul recognized yours and said, 'There she is. That is the one you have been waiting for.'" Julia leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. 34 years of marriage, 45 years since that fateful day when Florence had risked his life for strangers and found his future in the process. "Some things are worth the risk," Julia murmured, and Florence smiled. "Best risk I ever took," he replied, as he always did. They sat together as darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast New Mexico sky. Inside the house, they could hear their family, children and grandchildren visiting for dinner, voices raised in conversation and laughter. This was what mattered. This was what lasted. Not the dramatic moments, though those had their place, but the quiet evenings spent together, the accumulated days and years of partnership and love. Florence thought about that young ranch hand he had been, so desperate to prove himself, so hungry for a place to belong. He thought about Julia as she had been, the new schoolteacher with her green dress and her determination to make a difference. They had been so young, so full of dreams that had seemed impossible, but they had made those dreams real through hard work and faith in each other. They had built a ranch that would support generations to come. They had raised children who were good people making their own contributions to the world. They had loved each other through joy and hardship, through triumph and loss, through every season of their lives. As they finally rose to go inside, Florence took Julia's hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. After 34 years of marriage, the gesture was so natural it required no thought, but it was no less meaningful for its familiarity. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Julia asked. "For seeing me that day, for giving me a chance, for choosing me even though I had so little to offer, for building this life with me." "Florence Parker," Julia said, turning to face him fully, her eyes bright in the lamplight spilling from the house. "You had everything to offer. You just did not know it yet. And I have never regretted my choice, not for one single moment." They went inside together, into the warmth and light and love they had created, into the home they had built from nothing but hope and determination, and the willingness to risk everything for what mattered most. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human joys and sorrows. But inside the Parker house, 4 generations of family gathered around the dinner table, and at the head of that table sat Florence and Julia, their hands still clasped, their love still as strong as it had been on that September day so long ago when a cowboy had stopped a runaway stagecoach and found his destiny. The story of their meeting had become family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren who never tired of hearing it. But Florence and Julia knew the real story was not just that one dramatic moment. The real story was every day that came after every morning they woke up together, every challenge they faced side by side, every small choice to keep choosing each other over and over again. That was the real romance, the real adventure. Not the runaway horses or the daring rescue, but the decades of partnership that followed. Not the dramatic declaration of love, but the thousand small kindnesses and compromises and moments of support that made a marriage work. As dinner was served and the conversation flowed around them, Florence caught Julia's eye across the table and smiled. She smiled back, and in that smile was everything remembrance of who they had been, celebration of who they had become, and gratitude for every step of the journey that had brought them here. Some things are worth the risk. Florence had said it first, but they had both lived it, day after day, year after year. They had risked their hearts on each other and been rewarded beyond measure. They had taken the uncertain path and found it led to home. And as the evening wore on, and the family laughed and talked and lived the life that Florence and Julia had made possible, the old couple sat contentedly and knew that every risk had been worth it, every moment precious, every year together a gift that they had earned through love and loyalty, and the simple decision to keep showing up for each other, no matter what. The ranch would continue after them, their children and grandchildren carrying on what they had started. The horses would still be bred and trained to Parker standards. The land would still produce and provide. But the greatest legacy Florence and Julia would leave was not physical at all. It was the example of a love that had started with a moment of courage and grown into something that would echo through generations, a reminder that some things, the best things, are always worth the risk.